Say making friends as an adult is hard, but whoever said that for the first time had never tried being an overnight camp director, juggling the demands of a 24/7 job with friends back home. Everybody wants your time. Cassie and I certainly don't claim to be experts on this. We've lost some friends and damaged other friendships over our summers at camp, but we want you to learn from us. Grab your coffee, tea, or other beverage and come join us. Welcome to Beyond Camp, where we explore the intersection of camp in our lives. For too long, camp professionals have referred to being camp as being in a bubble. We're here to burst that bubble. We know that camp intersects with every aspect of our lives, and we're excited to delve into those. We're your hosts, Rachel Kent. My pronouns are she, her.
And I'm Cassie Bloy. My pronouns are also she, her.
We're here to go beyond camp with you. As a reminder, please subscribe to this podcast wherever you're listening today, and be sure to check out the show notes at gocamp.pro/beyondcamp. Now, let's get started. Today feels like a bit more of a personal episode, maybe a little bit more sensitive. But today, Cassie and I want you to learn from our mistakes and not lose all of your friends this summer. Now, I'm not saying that we always lose our friends every summer, like all of them, that we miraculously make new friends and then like following 8 or 9 months and then lose them again. But it's safe to say that we've both lost at least one or two friends or damaged our relationships. Over the summer. And I think sometimes that damage makes it even harder. Like you can start a summer with a really close friend and then just never be able to fully recover from that. So we want you to learn from our mistakes and do better than we have. Because also it's hard to make friends as an adult. As somebody who moved to a new city, I feel like it's hard.
Yeah. And we both moved to new cities in the middle of a pandemic. Like,
yeah, a little tricky.
it's hard.
Yeah. So let's just get right to this. Let's dive in, as we like to say. Cassie, why are we talking about this? Tell me about your experience with losing your friends. I say that in the most gentle way possible.
It's interesting because I feel like sometimes, like, I don't know if I think relationships were damaged, and the people who weren't my close friends, those are the ones that I lost. So more on like the acquaintance side, or like the people that kind of just maybe needed to phase out of my life, per se. That's not a good way to put it. Wow.
So you're saying that, like, okay, but let's revisit this. So you're saying that there's some folks that you were like already sort of naturally growing apart from, and then camp just like sped up that process. So it might have been like a year or so you were going to go your separate ways, but a few months of like very little communication and your path split then.
Yeah, that's a much nicer way of putting it.
All right. That's fair. And I think we all have people like that in our lives. And that's a healthy part of growing. I feel like I saw an Instagram quote recently that talked about how some folks just aren't meant to stay in your life forever. And that's okay. And that shows growth. And we come into each other's lives for certain reasons and all that good stuff.
And I think the other half of it is that, especially when I was first working at camp frontline as a camp counselor back in maybe the good old days, one should call them, before the world of like data everywhere and internet access all around us, it was very different, and just connecting with people was different in that time as well. And then I lost my train of thought just now as well. So
when you say like connecting with people was different before the time of data and cell phones and like people expecting to hear from you every day, like how did you make those connections back when you were frontline staff?
Yeah, with the people outside of camp, it was snail mail and phone cards. So you use those phone cards typically to phone family, because I was phoning from out of country, so they ate up a little bit faster. And snail mail was honestly the best option. So writing letters was a big part of how you connected. And if you didn't write it or start the process soon enough, stuff wouldn't make it back and forth in a 8-week span.
Do you think it was easier to keep friends then because we weren't used to being so instantly connected? Like there was a time where you didn't text your friends every 30 seconds, or now I sound like a really clingy friend. There was a time where like it was okay to like call somebody and not have them answer right away because it was home, like you were calling a home phone, or like,
totally.
we just weren't used to this like instantaneous response. Do you think it was easier then?
I think it was, because like texting wasn't even an option. Like that just wasn't a thing that was our primary mode of communication. It was starting to become more common, but it was like the old style where you had to push the 2 key 3 times to get a letter. Right?
P9, yes.
Thank you. Yeah. So I think it was easier to go longer time of frame without connecting face to face with people, and a letter or a quick, maybe I'm dating myself even more here, MSN message. um, yeah, message back and forth quickly. That was good enough. That's what we
Mm,
had, and that's what we were able to use.
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I think we are sort of coming at this from like maybe slightly different angles, which will make for good conversation, hopefully. I think when I think about why I want to talk about this is because I am a person who really values like deep relationships in my life, and I don't think I need like lots of folks, but the folks that I'm connected with, I feel really strongly about having deep connections with. And it's something that like really feeds me, and I know that, and I've grown to know that. But it's also been really hard when I go to camp because I'm also the kind of person who doesn't like to talk about my work. Drives my partner nuts. She loves to come home from school. She's a teacher and she talks all about her day. And it's lovely and I love it. And it's a beautiful moment. And then she's like, "So how was your day?" And I'm like, "It was fine." Because I've already lived it. And so I don't want to like relive it. But then I understand that
Mhm.
people like want to hear about my time, about my day, because it's an important way for them to connect with me. And so at camp, that was just like highlighted. I feel like it was even worse because people would be like, "Well, tell me about camp." And I was like, "Well, I can't just tell you about this like incident without you understanding the context and the backstory and the relationship between the two counselors and the camper and the history here. So like I'm just going to skip over." And then people feel like they're excluded from the experience that I'm having and I'm not willing to share with them. And
Mhm.
so I've given this a lot of thought about how to maintain healthy relationships over the summer. Um, from a friendship side or romantic wise, otherwise. And so I was excited to sort of dive into this. And I know you and I,
Yeah.
Cassie, have talked about how we're more introverted, and so friendships are important. But then losing camp and all that has made an impact on that. So
Yeah. And as you say, like this, the deeper connections, that's definitely something that aligns with me as well. Like I don't do small level chit chat. I get bored. I'm like,
mm.
why am I having this conversation? Do we need to talk about the rain outside again? No, no,
Yeah,
we
I will
don't.
say, I know that I've gotten old, perhaps because I'm very invested in different types of rain, and nothing brings me more joy than a gentle spring rain that I know is feeding the ground. And so, anyways, if anyone who wants to have a deep conversation with me about the rain and what it means for our world, please come talk to me. I think the other reason I want to talk about this is potential industry damage if we don't address this.
Mm,
I think
yeah.
burnout rates are so high right now. We know that in every industry. Um, you know, Teaching, frontline workers, healthcare, et cetera. Like burnout is really high, and the same can be said for camp folks.
Mhm.
Um, and I think strong relationships and people feeling grounded is a huge key to mental health, which also addresses burnout.
Yeah. And I can see that more and more being so prevalent in what we need to do at camp. And maybe it's not about losing our friends, but maybe it's figuring out the best way to maintain relationships and make sure that people are aware that, for me, it was making people aware that I'm at camp. You might not be able to just phone me and get a hold of me
Mhm. Yeah,
as time progressed.
yeah, absolutely. We're gonna dive into like sort of different types of friendships because camp pros need certain types of relationships in their lives, and those are really important. We're going to dive into boundaries as well in a little bit because I think that's also sort of like what you're touching on there.
Mhm.
um, I think that if we don't find ways to create more work-life balance, and that's what this comes down to, right? Like if we don't find more ways to address work-life balance, folks are going to continue to burn out. Like I know since not working at camp in the summer, all of a sudden I'm like, wow, this is neat. Like people do stuff in the summer and I can be part of that. And anecdotally, I've spoken to other folks who are having sort of a similar experience, or who are thinking of wandering away from camp altogether because it just isn't working for them and the people in their lives. And so I think it's important that we address this, and it's important that we give people the tools to do this. Um, because I think as well, there used to be a time where you and all your friends would work at camp. You would all be camp pros. And
Mhm.
in many ways, that's not happening anymore. I think folks have different circles. And so giving folks the tools to know how to maintain all aspects of their lives will help keep them in the industry a little bit longer.
Yeah, and I think we should note on. I think it's important to have people in your life that aren't family and aren't camp friends, that are outside of the camp world humans
Mm.
in your life. I think there's a value to that balance and to your personal wellness and growth as well, that they can push you in different ways and challenge your thought processes, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, Cassie, I'd love to get your thoughts on this. We often talk about like the phone a friend concept, and I think that's
Yeah.
very different than your friend, from back home that you would like go out on the weekend with, or you'd like go
Mhm.
rock climbing with. So tell me, like, to you, what does phone a friend mean and look like to you?
I think phone a friend depends on the situation I'm needing support in, right? If I'm having a personal conflict with an issue, if I'm having a situation arise between staff members that I'm not really sure how to handle and I need support in like hashing that out versus a camper behavioral concern, what it is who I'm going to phone. Or is it a policy that a parent's pushing back against that I'm just like, how do I respond? Right. So that's where I think the phone a friend is more of a, I have a concern I need that I don't know how to address, or I'm struggling with it. I just need an outside set of eyes. And I would pick my person based on what I'm needing support on. And that might not just be a friend, it might be an acquaintance, it might be a mentor, it might be a mentee. It could be any of those. Whereas those personal friends are those ones who I might consider people that are more, that know who I am as a human more so, that understand where the emotional drive comes from and what space might be needing to be held with me without me asking.
I like that. Uh, it's a beautiful thing when you have somebody in your life who sort of knows what you need without you being able to say it.
Mhm.
That being said, oftentimes we get there because at some point in our lives we communicated that and then that person picked up on it. So just to note that healthy relationships happen because we learn to communicate what it is we need from them, and then that
Yeah.
becomes natural. I'm not just saying everybody should be out there looking for that like unicorn friend who miraculously knows all these things about us, because it's way easier just to tell people and then have them know.
Yeah.
I think for me, a phone a friend is like what you touched on. It's somebody who I call because there's a, generally speaking, a work related issue. It might be my emotional state tied to work or something that's happened at camp or a crisis, but it's somebody who I'm calling who I know gets it. Now, they don't necessarily have to be from my camp or even from my organization because I work for a large
Mhm.
organization, but somebody who understands the context of camp, who understands the emotional drain of camp, who understands the limitations of camp. Um, because it can be hard to call somebody who's not from the camping world when you are feeling incredibly burnt out in that fourth week of July. For those of us who run camp in July and August, that midway point, and somebody be like, oh, just take a weekend off, like come to my cottage, like we'll hang out, we'll have a great time. And that can be almost harder because then you have to explain why you can't do all of those things. Whereas I would call my phone a friend who sort of knows camp, understands that, and who could give me some like tangible things to do in that moment, or just who can hold space and be like, I understand, like I've been there and I know that it sucks. And I think for me, those phone a friend relationships tend to be a little bit more formal. There's been like some sort of agreed upon discussion that we're going to be that person, whether it's like I've straight up been like, hey, call me anytime this summer if you need to chat.
Yeah.
Or if it's been somebody in my organization at a different camp, we've been like, yeah, like we'll chat, we'll catch up about this. And our friendship and relationship tends to be really focused around camp.
Mhm. And I think especially in those kind of phone a friend circumstances, it's almost nice to have it as like a regular set check-in as well, if they're your consistent phone a friend,
Mhm.
right? Maybe it's not just when emergencies come up, maybe it's a regular thing or a semi, like a bi-weekly, like that you connect and just check in with each other or talk about a concern. Maybe the other person has it but hasn't brought it up yet.
That's a great way to make sure that you are also available to somebody else,
Hmm.
by having those regular scheduled check-ins. Yeah, so I think that that phrase phone a friend is different than our like personal friends, our sort of like
Yeah.
outside of camp friends, we would say, and what we get from those. We're going to dive into boundaries right after this break because I think that ties really nicely into this. Because as we all know, we love boundaries. We love talking about them. We love discussing how we could form them. And I think a good, healthy set of boundaries that are well communicated are incredibly important to maintaining friendships during camp. And I just want to highlight once again that those boundaries have to be incredibly well communicated. Because if you don't share them and you just have them, you can feel great about having them. But if nobody knows them, they're kind of useless, in my humble opinion. So stay with us and we'll be right back.
The American Camp Association of Illinois believes in the transformative power of camp. With our work historically rooted in using camp as a tool for social change in both local and national communities, we envision a world where all children and young people have equitable access to camp opportunities. Join us in our journey today at acail.org.
We're back and diving into boundaries. Cassie, why don't I flip this to you to start with? What sort of boundaries have you put in place with friends, or what boundaries did you wish you had in place?
I think there's boundaries, but I'm also going to push back and say I think there's also expectations.
Oh, I love that. All right, tell me more about that.
Yeah. So something for me that really aligns with friendship or just relationships in general, this is a two-way street. If I'm the only one giving or reaching out on a consistent basis, and the other person either doesn't respond or doesn't reach out on a similar rate, that you're always initiating the conversation, that's probably not going to fly. I will walk away from friendships, relationships for less than. And I think there has to be that expectation that this is about two people or multiple humans. Like, you can't just be the person organizing all the things all the time. Even though I know as camp professionals, typically we like to organize things and do things, like sometimes it's nice to have other people do things, especially when you're in your busier season and you might want to connect because you do have that day off. I would have loved it if a friend had gone, hey, let's do something on this day. I'll plan it. Just be there. I probably would have gone, sure, that sounds great.
Especially with decision fatigue in the summer.
Oh my gosh.
So nice to have somebody playing something.
It really is. But then when it comes to boundaries, they're so important to honor each other's boundaries and a person's boundaries. So for me and one of my best friends, we're on the phone constantly, because we don't live in the same community. But it usually starts with a text message of, hey, do you have 5? Do you have 10? Are you free? Right? That we can be like, I need you, but do you have time? Right? And then there's a quick conversation of like, yeah, I've got time. No, I only have 10 minutes. Do you need more than that? Right? So that we can make sure. And then we actually watch the time for the other person and be like,
That's
okay,
great.
I know you have to jump into that meeting. Let's end the call. We'll pick up later. Or this dead zone that I have right before my house when we're on the phone and I'm Bluetooth to my vehicle. Hey, dead zone, call you back in 7.
Yeah, our camp road used to have that. There was just like, you would go down one hill and then all of a sudden it would disappear and you'd be like, okay, well, I guess I'm not talking to you anymore. I love that. I love the tie between boundaries and expectations. I think that's so important. Something that came to me when I was thinking about this is talking to your friends about what they're okay with you talking about. So we talked about the phone of friends, but maybe when after there's been a crisis at camp or you've dealt with something challenging, like I know for me, something often weighs heavily on me is if we have to call children's aid about something. There's been a disclosure. And so, but also knowing what your friends are comfortable with you talking about. Like, can you call them and say, hey, this has happened? Like, what are their trigger points? What are they comfortable hearing about? So talking with them about that, being like, what can I call you about? And what do you not want to hear about? How often do you want to hear about camp? Because we all know we can talk about camp till the cows come home. Matt informed me, our producer, that that's the phrase, not till the dogs come home, which apparently I used the other day. But we could all talk about camp at length. And so it's important to know what your friends' boundaries are around that. And then like what you said, I think for me, that expectation, when I think about it, as clearly communicating boundaries. So like my boundary would be like, hey, I will be able to talk to you, but if you need me, like I can text while I'm doing rounds at night in between like cabins or tent sites or whatever. That works for me. If you need to talk to me on the phone, it's gonna have to be after 11 p.m. or we're gonna have to reschedule it. And I would take that on as I have to be able to clearly communicate that boundary so I can set that expectation.
I think especially for those of us when we are in that full-time overnight camp person on property, that expectation has to be so clearly set. And for me, that looked like in that time, like even just with family as well, that boundary was like, it got to the point eventually that I didn't have to stay it. I was like, you're not going to be able to get a hold of me Sunday afternoon through Saturday morning. Like, let's just send me a quick text if there's an emergency and I'll get back to you. But it's probably best if you reach out on this day or this time.
Mm. My mother used to never call me at camp, and there was one year that I gave her a bit of a hard time about it. I was like, you never call me. And then she would call me and I'd be like, I can't talk, I'm busy. I can't talk, I'm busy. And she's like, this is why I don't call you, because I know when you're ready, you'll call me. Turns out she still does that in my day-to-day life as well. And then I didn't talk to her for several weeks and I heard about it. So If you're
Yeah.
listening to this, call the important people in your life. They want to hear from you.
They do. Yeah. I had the
But
exact same thing, but I knew it was bad when my dad would text me.
mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I think like boundaries around like best types of communication and expectations around that. When you can respond, when they can call randomly, if that's a thing that you have with your friends. I feel like a lot of millennials that sends us jolts of anxiety through us. I don't know if you've seen the Instagram meme that's like, I would pay extra to have not just caller ID, but like the reason for the call pop up on my phone so I know.
Yeah.
Um, I clearly fall into that category. Yeah, so I think really clear boundaries is important on both sides as well. And so it's important for your friends outside of camp to say, this is what I need, and this is what it looks like, and here's what I have to give. Because if you, as a camp pro, need to talk to somebody at 2 a.m., it is very reasonable that you need that. It's also just as reasonable that your friend who is working a 9 to 5 office job back in the city can't talk to you at 2 a.m. And those boundaries need to be clearly communicated. And so a conversation about that before camp starts might be helpful.
And as we're talking about this, I'm like, how can we help our frontline staff better set these expectations and such with their family and friends back home?
Mm-hmm. And I think part of that might be letting our staff know, especially our younger staff,
Mm-hmm.
our first time staff know, like, here's what it's going to be like to your friends. Like, here's what you should tell your friends about when you're going to have capacity, because a lot of our young staff are used to being in constant contact with their friends, so that when their friend has a crisis or is having a hard time or has something to share, they can Snapchat, Instagram, whatever it is that the youth are doing these days. Probably not talking on the phone, but maybe that's come back in fashion. They're used to being able to connect right away. And so we need to let them know, here's when you're going to be able to make these calls, and here's what your friends can expect of you. If you don't have
Mm-hmm.
cell service at camp, you sure as hell better tell your staff that before they show up on that property the first day.
Please tell them, and tell them how crappy the Wi-Fi is too, how
Hmm.
inconsistent it might be.
Yeah, be very clear so that they can then set those boundaries with their friends and they're aware of that. And that will help reduce a lot of anxiety as well.
Mm-hmm. It'll better prepare them and get them on the page, or decide that maybe you're not the right camp for them, and that's okay too.
Absolutely. So that sort of leads us into our next thing that we wanted to sort of talk about, which was the spring bucket list. And this is a strategy of mine that I like really sort of formalized, but I think other people do it in their own way. There was a good Go Camp Pro or Camp Hacker blog post about this once that I was inspired by, I think. And if I can find it, we'll link it in the show notes about things you should do before summer. It was like have a barbecue with your friends or something like that. But this is what my partner and I did, but I think it works for friends and friend groups as well. And we would in fact sometimes write it out, but it would be our spring bucket list, all the things we wanted to do before I went to camp. So there used to be a deal with frappuccinos at Starbucks in the spring. That was one of them. We would like take the dog to a certain place, go to a certain restaurant. Just all these things that we knew we weren't going to be able to do in the summer, like sit on a patio, weather permitting, because Ontario weather is up in the air in April and May. But we would do all of these things together. And so it was intentional time. And I knew that I was checking all of these boxes before we went away to camp. I don't know if you've ever tried something like that, Cassie.
I don't know if I've intentionally done it, but I know there's usually things that I like to do pre and post summer. And then there's like stuff that I like to make sure I make time for in the middle of the summer to kind of give myself a little kick to push through. Um, for a lot of me, it involved around like personal health and making sure I had like all of those important appointments done before, I would say before May long weekend typically, because that's when I always found myself really ramping up.
Yeah, that's a great idea as well. Yeah, I feel like I would like go to the dentist or something important. I think one of the other things on the blog post, if I remember correctly, was like set all your bills to auto pay so you don't have to stress about it in the summer. And that's not quite as fun as what we're talking about. But yeah, like those bucket list moments, like I would try and go out with like my work colleagues, would go out for a drink or a dinner before I went away in the summer. I would go and visit, like see my family. And I think like investing into that ties into this idea of the emotional bank account. And I think for
Mhm.
yourself and others, you need to do a lot of investing in the spring, which can be really hard because we're really tired and we're already stressed. But it doesn't just fill other people up, it fills you up too. And so spending intentional time planning it, to me, it helps like reinforce, it scaffolds those relationships going into the summer. So once you're in the summer and you're in the heat of the moment, you can't always be there. You're certainly drawing down that emotional bank account or that friendship bank account. But because you invested in it in the spring, ideally it's like a little bit higher. so that you're not completely degrading the relationship by the end of the summer because you've implemented some of the things we've talked about. And we're going to get to tips and tricks, and that will keep you like sort of level and not in the red, if we're really going with the bank analogy. But it just helps you build up and strengthen that friendship so that you can draw out of it throughout the summer a little bit.
Yeah, I really like that. I think having skills like that and intentionality built around it can really support a friendship or a relationship pre-camp and probably throughout the year as well, because there are busier and quieter times, and you might find your it might not be a spring bucket list for you, right? It could be a winter bucket list, or your timeline might be different, but maybe having seasonal bucket lists of things you want to do with certain people could be really beneficial to keeping those friendships established and valued.
Absolutely. And we're going to end our podcast in a little bit talking about sort of like the fall recovery. And we understand that we're sort of basing this off of the summer season that we would work, where we would be at camp sort of like June to August. But obviously this can be adapted to whatever season you're working in. Yeah, before we get to that, I think when I talk about bucket lists, I feel like bucket lists are often something that there are these huge, like grandiose ideas, like I'm gonna go skydiving or in a hot air balloon, which I would love to go in a hot air balloon, actually, if anyone's listening to this and has hot air balloon hookups, let me know. But for me, a bucket list it's essentially just like a to-do list. It's like a fun list of things that I know I can do. There might be like one thing on there that I can't get to that is like a little bit like, if the stars align, we'll do this. But it's actual things that we want to do. And it's the act of being intentional. My partner is very artsy, so she would like put it all nicely on a piece of paper. I would just like scrawl it on a napkin or something, or in my phone. But it's that act of being like, these are the things that I like and enjoy and that I want to do. And it could be the same thing. Like, it doesn't have to be something new every time, but it's just having that thought process. And it gives space for the other person to also say, these are the things that are important to me that we do. So like we would go to an art gallery, which is not my jam, but she loves them. And so I love that for her.
Yeah, well, and it fills up both people, right? Like it's something, I think it might depend on like how your relationship with that person, but sometimes seeing joy in one person can bring you joy yourself, which will elevate that emotional bank account.
Absolutely. So we're into the summer now. We've done our spring bucket list. We've built up those bank accounts. What little tips and tricks do you have, Cassie, for keeping friends over the summer?
Oof. I think everything we've covered, set those expectations, be honest with them about your availability. And if it has to be, I'll connect with you in the fall, follow through on that, because that's okay too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, something that can be easy, like people love mail. So buying like a little box, for the dollar store of little like thinking of you cards or something like that. You could pre-address the envelopes, buy the stamps, and then you can just like dash out like 3 lines and send them to somebody. So don't buy giant full-size cards you're gonna feel obligated to like fill the space with, because you're like, I spent $7 on this card. Now I need to write all these things. Like buy little cards that only need like 3 lines. Put a little note in them and send them off regularly, and schedule your time to do that. Say like, this is the time where I'm going to reach out to these people. As a person who is a little bit scatterbrained all over the place all of the time, because my brain is always going in a million different directions, having routine and schedules helps me. Like I need those notifications, and it's not that it's not genuine. I am thinking of that person, but if I don't schedule it in, it might not happen.
Yeah, and I think like the mail is so important. As much as email and text and messaging on whatever app exists, there's something personal about mail, that there's time commitment, there's all these other pieces in it that makes it feel more important.
Absolutely. And if you can't do the mail thing, that's fine. It could also just be a longer message. I have some friends that I exchange like longer text messages with. That's a beautiful thing. And so maybe it's that, or if you have a group of friends, it's having a group chat on, Facebook or wherever else, where you can drop in a longer paragraph about how your time is going. And the expectation of that group chat is that you're not firing back and forth one-liners. It's that everyone's providing updates when they can. So having that like good communication there.
That sounds really nice as well. Never done that.
I have a
like the
love-hate
sounds of it.
relationship with group chats. You can mute them when you need to, which is convenient. I do that sometimes to reduce my stress of seeing notifications. If I know I can't address something, I mute them all, and I'm like, I'll come back. And on Facebook, they will unmute when you set the right amount of time. But yes, really scheduling that time and being as intentional as you can. So I feel like we've covered we're throughout the season and now we're into the fall. How do you recover in the fall, Cassie, with respect to your friendships or relationships?
I think it's just connecting again, like making that intention to make dinner together, or uh, go for a walk or go on a hike. That's so nice to do before the snow flies. For those of you in Canada, like you don't have a lot of time before the snow flies in the fall sometimes. Um, so like doing those things that you might have not crossed off that bucket list in the spring that you can get to in the fall as well, because the weather's still good, and being honest with them and setting those expectations, because I know in the fall I'm exhausted. So letting people know that, I'm tired, but I have time at this here for you.
Yeah, and being mindful of that, like your first weekend back from camp might not be the weekend that you want to see all, 15 of your
Everybody.
friends. I don't
Yeah.
know how popular people are. I'm not that popular, but it might not be the time that you want to get together with a big group of people. So being mindful of that. For me, I find people like they want to hear stories about camp. They want to say, like, how was your summer? Like what happened? And it can be really hard for me to like draw things out. So sometimes ahead of time, I think about like, these are some stories I want to share. This is like a highlight. This was something I struggled with. And this is like a funny moment. Because if you only share the sort of like superficial, like fun, exciting things, like there was a great costume, it was hilarious. People might feel like they're not connected to you if you're able, but if you share like entirely the struggles, and I often feel like people are never going to want to talk to me about camp again. And I also sometimes have a harder time sharing those with people that aren't at camp. And so picking like a little bit of both, I find like helps paint a picture of what the summer was like, helps build connection, and allows me to keep boundaries about what it is that I am comfortable or not comfortable sharing.
And I think that's so important to honor, is that comfort level of yourself and then also like, don't forget those policies. There's some things you can't share, right? So keeping everything in mind. And I know for me, like, especially when I was frontline, my friends didn't want to hear about camp. I was the only one who did it. They didn't get it at all. And it was hard to share my things. And I think it wasn't necessarily the summer when I struggled with friendships. It was that return in the fall to
Mhm.
all of that. And then it was on to maintaining those relationships and friendships that I made at camp.
Yeah, and there is balance there because you also, I think we've all had friends who are like, do you still have to talk about camp? Like, how many more camp stories do you have to share? We've
Mhm.
heard, 500 of them. So being mindful of which ones you're going to share sort of right away and the others can draw out over time. Or scheduling time to be like, I would love to show you some photos from the summer and tell you a bunch of stories, and have it be that time that you get together. And then in future times, you're like, I would love to hear about that camping trip you did.
Yeah.
Sort of being thoughtful about that.
Mhm. So I think we've had a great time here talking about all kinds of things regarding friendships and relationships and how to maintain them and not lose all your friends when you're at camp this summer. And that there's ways to set those boundaries and expectations on both sides of the fence, for those of you in camp, those of you not in camp, and those of you in other industries as well. So we want to take a minute to thank you all for joining us here at Beyond Camp. We hope that you are able to connect and reflect with us as we journey beyond the property lines and bring camp with us wherever we might go. As always, we want you to be able to connect with us at beyondcamp@gocamp.pro. Email us anytime. Go straight to my inbox. I promise I check it sometimes. Please also remember to check out our show notes at gocamp.pro/beyondcamp. A big thank you to the team at GoCamp Pro for continuing to provide space for these conversations, to our sponsors at ACA Illinois for supporting us each and every week, to Matt and Jotham, our producers, for editing out our little glitches here and there, and to you, our listeners, for listening each and every week. Your dedication allows us to keep moving forward. Beyond Camp is part of the GoCamp Pro podcast network. Check out all our other podcasts at gocamp.pro/podcasts. Go well and safely, friends. We'll see you for the final episode of season 3 in a couple weeks.